All right, welcome. This short lecture will address some definitions of reading that are the most traditional ones, as well as begin to expose us to the concept of multiliteracies and show some examples of written samples that, kind of exemplify some of the ways in which strengths of kids or innovation or creativity can come through. The most common definition that you will find with regard to reading, which is also the mainstream definition in relation to the science of reading, is the simple view of reading. And this was by Go and Tumner in 1986, who, in identifying or trying to define what reading was, identified two main components of reading: language comprehension and decoding. And that decoding, meaning that is composed of the ability to kind of break the words down into component sounds, so phonological awareness, as well as knowledge, of course, of the component graphemes, the letters that would make up the words. And these components would be localized or would be accessed through the process of what's called decoding or breaking down the words, which also enables us to recognize the words that we're reading. The other big component is language comprehension, okay? And that, of course, assumes that that language is produced via speech. And that is what results, the perfect balance of these two subcomponents is what results in having a good handle over comprehension over what is read. An approach to reading that comes from that simple view would suggest then that all you need is this balance of good or unsupported access to comprehension, as well as to word recognition, right? And so those two big components being here on this this graphic show you that if you do have good word recognition, meaning that you do not need supports with being able to break down words and or being able to extract the meaning of the text that you are reading, then that would be that you have typical quote unquote language development. If you have good recognition of text or can break down words, but you still need some support with comprehension, then that would mean that you have a good access to being a decoder, but you may have some language-based challenges, right? And then to the left, you would find, in the upper left, you would find that there might be some needed supports in word recognition, and with language comprehension being strong, that's how usually the neurodivergent manifestation of dyslexia was initially defined. And at the bottom left, you would find individuals who need both supports in both areas of literacy as potentially being those individuals who are identified as having both dyslexia as well as maybe some other language-based, an additional language-based needed for area that needs support. You can see that I'm trying to play with language here. So all this to say that, this is a fairly simplistic way, because what does it mean to have good language comprehension and what does it mean to have good word recognition? Is sort of like they're very big components. And so we're going to see how that definition under the simple view still has evolved as of recent. The science of reading approach or framework for defining reading or literacy skills, which is also a framework for pedagogy. So you'll see a lot about a lot of information about what are called the reading wars, right? So back in the 1980s and even before that, there were these two camps of approaches to literacy instruction: the whole language approach, which kind of viewed reading as not needing to be explicitly taught, really tied to language, kind of coming out of that initial view of the simple view, right? And with the language comprehension sort of leading the way. And then there was through standardized testing, there was an analysis of scores and kids that were not, as per the standardized testing, passing the curricula or even being at grade level. And so there was a need, a group of researchers, Hugh Katz, Alan Kamai, Hollis Scarborough, a number of them came up with um, a critique to the simple view in, sort of proposing the need to make it a lot more explicit or make it a lot more um, um, fine grained, right? Making the definitions more fine grained. And so a useful way of looking at literacy that I have that I have used over the course of my practice, and that is now very much in line with the science of reading, is the reading rope, or the reading strands by Hollis Scarborough since 2001. Okay, so this is not new. So Hollis took the two components that Gao and Tumner had come up with and said, okay, but we need to look and see what are the component skills within each. And so the blue ropes here, there are two ropes in case your you have color sensitivity. The bottom section says word recognition, and those ropes are actually blue, and those include phonological awareness, which involves being able to break words down. We talk a little bit about that in a moment. Into component structures, decoding, which is the breaking down of those words, so the analysis as well as the putting them together, which is the synthesis, and then sight recognition of any familiar words, because it's not like we break down every single word that we encounter once we become, quote unquote, what would be called more automatized in our reading or more skilled. And then we had done quite a bit of research, in the late 1980s to kind of devise these subcomponents of word recognition, but we had not done a lot of research to devise what language comprehension actually meant. And so Hollis Scarborough, in collaboration with a number of other educators and speech language therapists, came up with the red strand, which is the one on the top. That's this language comprehension that talks about, or essentially makes more fine-grained what those language comprehension areas are that also fit in the definition of skilled reading. So background knowledge, which involves experiential knowledge, right? Situational knowledge, vocabulary, or word knowledge, language structures, which involve the exposure to the breaking down of, right? What are the bigger parts of discourse too, in addition to words. Reasoning of verbal information that involves also a detachment from like what is concrete language. So you think about figurative language, you think about inferencing, and then literacy knowledge, which is this awareness of an experience with different genres as well as different concepts that could be one could be exposed to in our own experiences of reading and writing. Right. And so with the advent of Scarborough's reading rope, then there was a lot more that could be looked at, in the process of literacy, and also the pedagogies could get a lot more specific, right? That was the word that I was thinking of instead of fine grain. So that's the beginning of it. And so the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about what are these subcomponents within each of these areas, particularly the word recognition area. And then we'll also talk a little bit about a cognitive view of reading that has also been studied and that has been looked at within the context of word recognition. To be able to read, traditionally what we call reading, which is breaking down the words, right, that we encounter, we have to have alphabetic knowledge, we have to have awareness of print, and we have to have what is called phonological awareness. This is based on research, primarily with alphabetic languages and primarily with English speaking countries. All this to say that phonological awareness, for example, will manifest very differently in languages that are syllabic, for example, or tonal, right? So, not to assume that all the components here are the components that would be expected in every language that there is in the world, including think about too the fact that at the level of sign languages, there's also knowledge of structure, right? But that those knowledges and those the ways in which those processes of analysis might be different than how we call them within reading, even though a person who uses, say, for example, American Sign Language to communicate is a person who also can read in English when taught to read in English, right? So, all this to say that this calls more for the idea that we are actually multi-language users or multilingual users, regardless of the modality that we are imposing on ourselves as the communicative modality. Components of this idea of being able to break down words is what is engendered in emergent literacy, and that emergent literacy depends on, of course, on based on research with speaking children, on oral language skills that are achieved or acquired or learned or socialized during infancy and toddlerhood. All these to say there's a lot of work that needs to still be done for non-speaking individuals who are able to achieve literacy, or even to disrupt the idea of what literacy actually means beyond the printed word, right? It also suggests that in order to be able to be in this space of breaking down words, you have already also developed what are called metalinguistic skills. And those metalinguistic skills basically call on the use of language to talk about language, right? And on the use of language to break down language. So you think about the fact that, as you became speech language therapist, you learned words like syntax, you learned words like morphological derivations, and that those words are also very meta. You're using words that have been devised by linguists to talk about language in order to talk about the language that you're using and or the language that your clients are using. This emergent literacy would call upon those decoding skills that we talked about. So the alphabetic knowledge, the print awareness, and also what are called code related processes. So I mentioned earlier that we would be talking a little bit about a cognitive based approach to defining literacy as well. And that's sort of what this alludes to. Phonological processing, awareness, memory, and retrieval. This is a different phonological process than the phonological process that is used in speech sound disorders, let's say, right? Which is a part of a person's approximating of an adult model, right? A child approximating an adult model. Phonological processing really calls for what it sounds like. It is the processing of sound information, right? And that involves an additional 3 subcomponents that we'll talk about soon. So when we talk about alphabetic knowledge, first we talk about the knowledge of letters, okay? And I do note that is if exposed to Western literacy, or at least, alphabets that are exposed to that incorporate the names of letters and the sounds of letters. With regard to learning the letters, a lot of the work that has been done by Rebecca Tremond, and also you see Justice and et al. There, um, mentioned, have looked at how kids learn letters and which are the letters that are prioritized first. And the four sort of more predominant patterns in learning are noted there for English speaking kids, again, in the US, right? The majority of them. The children do prioritize learning the letters that are in their names first. They also prioritize the letter names that are found in the letter sounds. In other words, for example, the letter B has the ba in its name. That letter is learned before the letter W, right? Which doesn't really have the letter H, doesn't really have the sound in its name. There's earlier letters in the alphabet are learned first, and latter letters are learned last. And there is a hypothesis, again, based on very much on spoken, on individuals who use speech, that the earliest babbled consonants are also the ones that are learned first. So this would point to the idea that with experience in use and exposure, which is sort of that statistical view of learning, we end up learning the parts of language that we are exposed to. The second component is this print idea of print awareness, and awareness of print, especially before entering kindergarten, is seen as something that is preparatory for what would be good literacy skills later, right? And again, all of this has to be looked at with a caveat because there are communities that pass literacy information via speech or via signs or via gestures. So to assume that everything is, this print-based approach also needs to be interrogated. But the children who are seen as being ready for the US American way of learning are children who have shown some interest and appreciation for print. I don't know if you remember growing up, but I know my daughter, for example, would pay a lot of attention to logos and symbols around, the places where we would drive a lot. It was her way. So place and space also have a huge impact, just like situations, right? And experience have a huge impact in learning these language structures. And the reason why I'm saying these things is also because this alludes to a different model of literacy learning that I'll show you just the beginning of this semester and at the end of this presentation. There's an awareness that print conveys meanings, and not only is there an appreciation for print, but kids start asking, like, what does that say? Or what, does it say this or this says that? And they assume that it says, a big M says McDonald's, right? Understanding that there are conventions in print that are common, that print units like words and letters can be found in books and they can be counted and they can be pointed at, right? And then that there are relationships between those print units too. So not only that there are letters and words, but also that the words themselves together hold a meaning. So, a child may say, what does this say as a word, but also may point at a whole entire sentence. And importantly, alphabetic knowledge and print awareness precede this next set of of skills, if you might say, which are the code-related processes that we talk about. Code-related processes assume that there is a cognitive system that's involved in the process of reading. So there's attention, there's visual processing, there's also memory, there's also rehearsal, right? All of that is there, and inhibition, right? All of that is there to help us remember and access information. And in order to be able to phonologically process what is there. So the brain is processing the information that is usually speech stimuli, right? Because initially it's all auditorily presented, right? And it incorporates three code related processes to be able to do that. And I say that they're cognitive based because they do incorporate memory and they do incorporate attention as these pieces. Phonological awareness, phonological memory, and phonological retrieval. By the way, for children who are neurodivergent, identified, and labeled with dyslexia, usually the code-related processes are the ones that are most affected, right? Or that need the most supports in the pedagogy. And then there's also orthographic processing, which goes hand in hand. So the processing of sound and the processing of visual information, that are the letters, the graphemes that are on a page, are going to be coming hand in hand. And so here it is, and this is based on a what do you call it? A model that was initially looking at working memory and how it related to literacy. Phonological awareness are your grapheme to phoneme correspondences. So those GPCs are learned. Not only, you can't only memorize the letter names, right? You have to actually learn what the sounds that those letters make, and then sort of also deal with sometimes ambiguity, especially in languages like English. That phonological awareness is also what supports decoding, so the breaking down of words into their components: syllables, onsets and rhymes, phonemes, right? In order to be able to read them, right? It is also phonological awareness that supports spelling, which is the encoding. So it's the opposite, right? Is the extracting from memory, long-term memory, these grapheme to phoneme correspondences that also may involve some morphemes, right? To be able to then synthesize them, put them together, and then to be able to write them down. And it is also what promotes, phonological awareness, what promotes fluent or fast or fluid word recognition. And that word recognition also happens for familiar words that we encounter all the time, but also for words that cannot be broken down, right? There are words that are that have to be learned as whole units. The second component is phonological memory. And so phonological memory is this hypothetical space in your memory system that stores information for a very short period of time, and that translates that information either from the visual domain into the spoken domain to be able to read things, or from the spoken domain into the visual domain to be able to spell things, right? There is a motor component there too, of course, as well as these things that are supposedly happening in your mind don't happen in isolation, right? They're happening in tandem with being able to extract knowledge about what you're learning, knowing the vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm giving you very fine-grained information about potentially what's happening in the brain that has been looked at, right, or has been hypothesized by teachers that, not teachers, by researchers, and also that have these ideas have been the ones that have then prompted researchers to develop assessment tools. So the comprehensive test of phonological processing, for example, tests all of these components, and it's often used to assess kids to determine whether there is the presence or needs for supports in the area of dyslexia. The final aspect of code related aspect that is involved is phonological retrieval. So you do need the memory, you do need the knowledge of these subcomponents, but it's not going to happen quickly enough. You know, this idea of fluency, right? Which also, again, we need to be interrogating it, because sometimes people can be deep processors of information, but it doesn't mean that, you know, that they're going to be fast, right? It also is ableist. If we think about what stutterers, you know, have identified as sources of ableism in the way that they are constructed as individuals with disabilities. So who do not have disabilities, but they're constructed as disabled. So the final processing component, though, is this phonological retrieval. And what this basically means is that you can rapidly name the knowledge pieces. So phonological retrieval is often assessed through what's called a rapid automatized naming task. You know, it could be a list of colorful animals that you have to name the animal and the color. It could be a list of digits. Okay, so that's how it's usually done. Phonological memory is usually assessed through the use of a non-word repetition, a list of made-up words that people repeat, and then they are given a point or a zero based upon whether they got it correctly. And of course, the memory piece has to do with the length of the word. As the length increases, suppose, you know, the memory, the accuracy of repetition is going to decrease. There's all the other components that are important there too, like how similar is the non-word to real words, because that also has an impact in either creating what is called, according to researchers, competition, or creating what is called a facilitative effect. So that's phonological memory. Phonological awareness is assessed through all kinds of different tasks that hopefully I included here, but if not, we will talk about in the next few weeks. So included here are some phonological awareness skills, just because that's, of all the code-related processes, it's the one that is most studied, and also that is the most systematically implemented in instruction, and the science of reading is big on this. So based on English speaking children, and again, look at ages with a caveat, you know, this is when the schools potentially would be expecting mastery. It begins with the ability to recite rhymes. So it begins at a very shallow stage, right? Or shallow ability. So think about shallow phonological awareness being very sort of like with big units of language or big units of words. And then it moves into a lot more fine grain or deep, right? And so when you get into like being able to match the consonants between two words, being able to identify the rhyme portion of words. So you know that every word has an onset, that's a consonant, every syllable. Although in some languages there can be empty onset, syllables, but we'll leave it at that. But let's say that syllables have an onset, and then anything that follows that onset, that consonant, is going to be what is called the rhyme. So being able to identify the rhyme, being able to divide a word into onset and rhyme, all the way down to being able to segment the clusters in a consonant cluster, or delete a part of a cluster in order to make up a new word, right? So like clamp to lamp, right? Being able to delete that allows you to spell more, that allows you to read a word. Maybe you know the word clamp, or maybe you know the word lamp, and then you add a word, a letter, or an onset, a consonant in that cluster, and that allows you to read the word clamp. So all this to say that that when we talk about phonological awareness and we talk about reading or decoding, it is very complex a process too. The negative of kind of adhering to the idea of the science of reading as component structures only or structural aspects of language. Um, the positive is, of course, it makes a lot easier to kind of develop an idea of where people are struggling, quote unquote. And also, it allows you to choose targets for intervention or instruction, right? The negative of it is that it can be very drill focused or drill based, and that reading is much more than being able to sort of parse down or parse the words on a page. So keep that in mind for when we get into instruction a few weeks from now, that we need to know that, yeah, this is definitely something that is needed, especially in school-based settings, but it shouldn't be the only focus of instruction. The next few slides cover the idea of reading development. And again, okay, because these are based on stage like models, or the idea that children can just like be little sponges. And it's not that situational experiences and relationships are not conducive to learning. They absolutely are. But we have to be careful that we don't just focus on ages and stages as the only way to characterize learning, because we know that some of us may follow different ways of learning, different pathways of learning. And when I say different, even that has to be interrogated, right? Like different from who? And then let's say all of us are diverse in our learning pathways. And then the second piece is that, yeah, of course, like situations and relationships are important, but they themselves cannot be the only source of learning of language that sometimes has to be explicitly taught as well. So I go back and forth. I don't over drill structure, but also I do not just lean into what would be called the whole language approach to expect that kids are just going to be exposing, or extracting information that they need to know because of academic expectations, right? So at this time, we're in a space where we can imagine what liberated literacy and languaging can be like, but we're not quite there in being able to implement it. So again, here are some of the stages. Shawl is very famous. I think that their stuff is still being used nowadays. It is tied to grade level standards in some cases, and reading materials like there's a couple of series of books that for children or youth that have develop like readability formula. Like they also kind of took into account this idea of stages. The other thing is that this idea of stages of reading development has also been used in spelling development. And again, this is great as demarcations. Same with milestones, right? Demarcations are ideas for how literacy potentially can evolve, but it should not just be used as a standard for everybody. And again, here, the last two. What's interesting here is that you start to notice that as we get into more sophisticated approaches to literacy, the stages themselves get a lot less descriptive, right? And Shaw used to say that very few people, if anybody, gets into this idea of construction and reconstruction. That stage 5 that's supposed to be reached somehow during college level sometimes doesn't even happen for people. Again, I mean, it's like I'm big on functional language too. So like the same with literacy. What is the function of literacy in our lives? What is the function of reading and writing? What is the function of spelling? And what do we use it for? And I think that that's an important piece if we don't have to be writing big papers or giving big lectures to people to impress anybody, if we don't have to be writing notes so that a doctor reads it, then our literacy is going to develop to the degree that we need that, those sets of skills. And I firmly believe that's the case with language too. Right? Like we use language to communicate, we use language to build intersubjectivity or to build our own conceptions of ourselves in relationship with others. So this idea that there is a standard or an ideal of a language and a literacy skill set has to be maybe, problematized some. Not to say that we don't want to have standards, like those are not going anywhere, and that we don't want to support people that need the support. No, absolutely not. But I also, that critical side of me is always there thinking like, yeah, but the way that we use language is really what drives, the way that we use literacy is really what drives the degree to which we develop it. All right. The last little piece I want to expose you to is the multiliteracies model of literacy. And the reason why I want to do this is because it is the most comprehensive, and I'm not sure why SLPs don't use it, because for the populations with whom we are interacting, you think about even the adult client or the adolescent client, who suffered a stroke, right? Like I had a client who was in her 20s or late, actually she was 18 when she had a stroke due to birth control and smoking at the same time. And, like the way she needed support in reading and writing again, right? And so we think about that, and we think about the way that we teach reading and writing is very, bimodal, is this idea of print and speech, right? Comprehension, understanding, expression, formulation, right? Composition. But what Callants, Keys, and Cope and the New London Group, really, and you need to go like and research what the New London Group is, because it was like fascinating to find about them. So, but I'll give you that as your homework. Find out like who the New London Group is. Came up with this idea that we really should be talking about multiliteracies in this 21st century, um, as consumers of text and users of text, but really forever, right? Because the reality of it is that we use language and literacy dependent on situations and also dependent on the form in which it is constructed, right? So you could have text, you could have image, you could have a whole page with one word in the space, right? The idea of objects, your own body as speech and text, like gestures, right? Sound, all of that goes into what's called forms. So already they came up with the concept of multimodality, right? Which is so helpful for communicative disabilities because, and really so helpful for all of us because we all communicate through different modalities all of the time. We all that language in that way. And so the idea is that we are disrupting this concept of literacy being just structures on a page. It's not that they don't count. Of course, absolutely. Structures do count. They are part of the pedagogy, which I don't talk about here. I'm just mainly talking about the definition of literacy under their framework. And they absolutely look at situations and relationships and modalities and modes of presentation, all of that. But the idea is that meaning making happens, both in terms of how the text and the speech and the different representations that it may take are arranged in place and are arranged in time. Again, so already you're thinking about this is a lot more functional too than this idea that you have to learn a specific set of skills based on a standard, right? So just there to say it is a little bit more abstract. Um, But there's a lot of literature that has come out that also uses this approach with, of course, your populations who are considered to be in need of such supports, like your multilingual learners, your disabled learners, but it can really be used for everybody. In the next few slides, I have some examples of emergent writing where you can see how writing also evolves from a potentially more phonologically based, approach. So again, this idea of language comprehension or language use kind of driving the specification of our literate lexicons is not unfounded, but it is not the only way, right? So here you have an example, and there's also a drawing. This is my daughter when she was, 5. No grown-ups allowed in her clubhouse. And here's another example. The witch wasn't wearing her hat or her ugly dress, and the vampire too. So here what you see, which is interesting, is that there's a beginning of separation between words, that there's the ing, so morphology is already beginning to be very present, although allowed was present in the previous one, the ed. There's the use of pronouns. There's also this idea of the colon as, kind of elongating that two that is there. And here you see a poem around 5 years, 10 months. They just now dashed when I was about to crash, when my heart was almost smashed. And before we drank some tea, it was like, I always wish that there was just a part of me that was made for you, a part that was made for you and me. And this was actually Leah's, my daughter's, very first song when she was 5 years old. But you already see that there's also not only the beginning of that there's also rhyming, that there is a rhythm that goes with it, that there is in both irregular and regular past tense. And there's play with the language itself. And so all to say, like, if I were to strictly look at her from the standpoint of stage theory, right, she would be still in the same stage, but look at the diversity of the samples and the richness of the samples that were being produced. And these are all like invented, spellings. It wasn't homework that was given. So that is the creativity in children that sometimes we don't tap into because we don't believe that they're knowledge constructors. So I encourage you to tap into that. And finally, here's a sample from a child with dyslexia that we have who is one of our subjects in a paper that we're writing about how to look at dyslexia, dysgraphia, and DLD from a strength-based lens. That one's out for review. And you see a boy named Bob loved astronauts. They were his stars. One night, Bob got ready for bed and was all tucked in. Bob had a dream where he was in a spaceship and he was a famous astronaut. In his dream, Bob went to the moon, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter. And he made friends with aliens who, for I can't remember, who asked for his autograph. He also got fame, friends, places of, I don't know what that means, material, and even a statue. Their spaceship got upgraded so that it could fly at the speed of light and have lasers. So again, if we are merely focusing on the fact that this child, the spelling may not be at a par with his grade level or I think it's a he. His grade level, what would we be missing in the creativity? And do we notice that there's also disciplinary knowledge about science when he's talking about the names of planets, and he's talking about what comes with kind of obtaining privilege and access to material goods, right? So it's important to look at samples, and particularly at literacy, from a creative space, and use as many lenses as you can in doing so. The next slide has a video that I encourage you to play that talks about why literacy is important from the voices of children and youth in general.